This is the podcast for Managing for Sustainability in the pre-contact week 2. And today we're looking at sustainability themes. What issues are important to companies in relation to improving sustainability? Well, there are those who feel that there is enough food in the world to feed everyone, providing that underlying issues of equity and social value are addressed. However, there is an increasing number of international groupings of academics, politicians and producers who feel that the first half of the 21st century will bring challenges that cannot be addressed by the continuation of existing approaches to increasing food production. In other words, business as usual is not an option. These challenges have been summarised by the then government chief scientific advisor, Professor Sir John Beddington, who talks about a perfect storm of interrelated and additive factors. You've already seen this in the guided study for session 1. Raskin and others in their article, The Century Ahead, Searching for Sustainability, looked at 4 scenarios of how we might behave as a world society and how far they might contribute towards a sustainable vision. This slide shows some of the issues they identified as important and that they modelled to explore how to become a sustainable world. You'll be looking at this in the guided study for this session. Our global businesses have to sit within these kinds of sustainability aims. In the social and economic area, they suggest these aims of tackling the creation of strong communities, everyone having enough to live comfortably, and changing attitudes to well-being. Without these, other sustainability initiatives will fail. In the environmental area, they suggest the key aims are tackling climate change, protecting resources, and how we steward the land. In the UK, our customer base will connect more naturally to sustainability themes closer to home. These are the 12 measures of sustainability the government has identified in its Sustainability Development Indicators report in 2013. There are another 23 supplementary measures giving more detailed assessment under the 3 key areas. There's an exercise in guided learning to assess how many sustainability measures your business might influence. UK government policy brings these together in 4 priority action areas: sustainable consumption and production, climate change and energy, natural resources protection and environmental enhancement, and sustainable communities. Now here I've brought together the sustainability themes commonly quoted by UK businesses. And they talk about designing durable products, using sustainable raw materials, reducing waste, achieving smaller business and product footprints, working with suppliers to be more sustainable and resilient, making commodity supply chains transparent, labelling products, trading ethically, providing safe employee working environments and fair pay and conditions, partnering local communities, and helping customers become more sustainable, or domestic customers having more sustainable lifestyles. We'll now pick out 5 of these and look at them in more detail. First one is sustainable raw materials. These are some of the characteristics of raw materials that come from unsustainable sources. They incur extraction from limited reserves, such as minerals and fossil fuels. They're consumed beyond the rate of sustainable natural production. An example would be wild fish. And they damage or destroy other natural capital, such as ecosystem services destruction, as in rainforest loss. Second key issue on the list to pull out is waste, how it's managed and how it's dealt with. Various people have expressed ideas on the waste hierarchy, a hierarchy of actions to follow in waste management, where you tackle the first point to an optimum level, then move to the second point and so on. This is a more comprehensive list than most. It starts again with redesign. So redesign or resource the process or the product generating the waste so that you avoid it completely. The next one will be to reduce. Use less of the resource so that you make less waste. Repair items so that you mend them when they're broken rather than have to start again with new ones. Reuse products or packaging over and over again. And then you come to the end use points. So when eventually you do get to the end of the life of the product, use the materials to make new products. If you have to throw it away in such a way that you recover energy from the waste, often called energy recovery. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy is disposal, when you can do nothing else with it. So let's look at something a bit closer to the food industry. Here's an example of how big the problem of waste is. The World Resources Institute reports that nearly a quarter of all world food calories produced in 2009 were lost or wasted. Food loss is the term used for production end losses. Food waste is the term used for losses downstream from the farm gate. And losses and waste occur throughout the food chain, and this is a key issue of sustainability, as waste food represents wastage of all the resources used to make it. In the poorer countries, it's the upstream part of the food chain where the losses occur, and proportionally little is wasted in the home. People are too poor to afford wasting precious food. In richer countries, the food production and processing end loses much less, but food waste in the home is a much greater proportion of total losses. A third key area is improving environmental performance, and one that companies often find more obvious and sometimes easier to tackle or justify. This is sometimes called eco-efficiency, because it usually means doing less of something bad per unit of product. Legislation is strong in this area, as environmental protection is one of the more mature areas of sustainability. Legislation is now coming into the area of carbon management, with UK national targets to reduce carbon emissions by 80% by 2050, needing regulation to achieve it. Action in this area uses the concept of a footprint, the size of the impact on the environment that an activity makes. But it's not just carbon footprints on the atmosphere that feature in this topic, but also any resource footprint, especially water. There is another idea of footprint that brings together all the resource impacts and needs and convert that into how many planet Earths would be needed to provide those resources, a very pictorial expression of how sustainable the organisation or person is. After all, there is only one spaceship Earth. You will be calculating your personal footprints in the guided study. The Carbon Trust are UK leaders appointed by the government to help companies develop carbon management strategies to reduce emissions. A strategy will start by seeking to reduce internal carbon emissions, then try to reduce indirect emissions in the supply chain, for example, carbon emissions from electricity generation or from other suppliers, and then as a last resort, consider carbon offsetting. We will look again at this in the Contact Week. The fourth area is to focus on supply chain accountability, transparency, and product labelling. This provides consumers with key information to make their buying decisions. Examples where external bodies provide accreditation for standards against ethical and performance criteria are fair trade, one of the longest running schemes relating to customer demands for a fair life and livelihood for producer communities. The Forestry Stewardship Council, relating to customers' concerns over timber felling impacts on primary forests and biodiversity, organic production accreditation relating to health concerns over agrochemicals in food and impacts on the soil, product carbon footprints responding to climate change fears, and food miles based on an assumption that local food is more sustainable. However, research is showing that food miles is a crude and sometimes inaccurate measure of sustainability. It assumes products from nearby have lower energy inputs. But this is not always true, as this modelling study shows. The graph shows primary energy inputs into apples on the retail shelf, comparing 2 EU sources and 2 Southern Hemisphere sources. It shows that for all apples, increasing energy use during storage until sale occurs. Because of the 6-month shift of season between the northern and southern hemispheres, there's a part of the year in the EU when southern hemisphere apples are comparable with or lower energy than EU apples just before harvest. Otherwise, this modelling study shows that one EU source has almost always lower energy. So sometimes it is more sustainable to source apples according to seasonality, not proximity. This may also be true for winter salad crops imported from Spain, for example, rather than grown in heated greenhouses in the UK. The bigger issue here against sustainability is not so much food miles, perhaps, but eating out of season. The last issue I want to focus on is dietary change. Reducing the proportion of meat in the diet and choosing a more vegetable-based diet is essential to achieve sustainability targets globally, particularly relating to cutting greenhouse gas emissions. It would also be good for health. Per capita UK meat consumption is more than twice the world average and nearly 3 times that of developing countries. As the global food system becomes more resource constrained and developing countries lift themselves out of poverty, measures to tackle sustainability that deal with food consumption will acquire relevance beyond just the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. Diets will have to change. Now, we need to spend some time in the next few slides understanding carbon and greenhouse gas emissions in more detail, as this is an important and fashionable focus for sustainability. We must first recognise that carbon dioxide is not the only cause of climate change. There are many gases which enhance the warming effect of the atmosphere, which we call the greenhouse effect, and so are called greenhouse gases. Global warming potential is used to compare this effect with that of carbon dioxide. So it starts with carbon dioxide having an index of 1. But when you look at methane, it has 21 times the effect on global warming compared with carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide has 310 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide, and the hydrofluorocarbon 23, a whole series of chemicals used in refrigeration, has a global warming potential of over 11,000 compared with carbon dioxide. So to get the whole picture, then we really need to talk about the global warming potential of each gas. Summing all the greenhouse gas emissions and taking into account their global warming potential gives the carbon footprint for the organisation, measured in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of product, or appropriate units for whatever you're talking about. Also on carbon and climate change, you hear of companies claiming to be carbon neutral. They continue to consume non-sustainable carbon dioxide, generating fossil fuels, but try to offset these emissions by reducing emissions elsewhere or absorbing carbon dioxide elsewhere. This is called carbon offsetting. This must be as a last resort when every effort has been made to avoid carbon dioxide emissions and then reduce them. Carbon offsetting involves paying someone to make equivalent reductions in emissions somewhere else, or planting trees to absorb carbon, for example. Pressure groups, though, often criticise offsetting as a distraction, taking away the pressure from businesses in making real reductions. It doesn't cure climate change, they say, but it may delay it. Also, instead of looking at greenhouse gas emissions for an organisation, you can analyse them for a single product throughout its life cycle across the many organisations involved in its life, from raw materials through manufacturing, distribution, use, and disposal or recycling, and calculating the emissions created as a result of all related activities and materials. This view is valuable for two reasons. First, in many developing countries such as the UK, greenhouse gas emissions arising from consumption of goods and services is greater than the emissions actually produced in the country. The UK is a net importer of greenhouse gas emissions, and this trend is increasing. To ensure global reduction targets are met, it is critical to understand the full picture of carbon emissions driven by consumption, regardless of where the emissions occur. Second reason why product carbon footprinting is a valuable view is that consumers recognise their role in contributing to climate change and are beginning to demand more information on the impact their purchasing decisions and behaviours have on greenhouse gas emissions. A consumption-based view of emissions helps us understand not just what the emissions are across the economy, but why they exist. Product carbon footprinting provides the information these consumers need to make more informed choices. It also acts as a starting point for businesses looking to reduce the emissions associated with their products and unlock resulting cost savings, as well as providing a basis for developing future low-carbon products. Product carbon footprinting identifies the true drivers of greenhouse gas emissions, often revealing some surprises. It therefore enables better targeted, more effective emissions reduction and cost-saving initiatives, which may or may not fall under the company's direct control. Some companies who have used this methodology have already reduced product-level greenhouse gas emissions by 15 to 20%. Considerable cost savings have also been achieved to energy and waste efficiency measures across the food chain. Product carbon footprinting also helps companies strengthen relationships with suppliers, particularly if it reveals cost-saving opportunities up the supply chain. Well, here is a greenhouse gas footprint for potatoes to the farm gate. It shows the big greenhouse gas contribution that fertiliser plays in production and the gains that could be made by innovating in the way growing potatoes use machinery. But when you widen the system boundary to look at the whole life cycle of potatoes, the agricultural inputs are small compared with the energy used in the home in cooking. Taking a broader view of the whole of UK agriculture and its greenhouse gas emissions, we see 4 of the key greenhouse gas sources, and we'll look at them now in more detail. The emissions are carbon emissions and loss of soil organic matter, emissions of oxides of nitrogen from soils, agricultural methane sources, and greenhouse gas emissions from land use changes. The loss of carbon from changes in the organic content of agricultural soils represents 1/3 of the total industrial emissions of carbon in the UK. It's 13 times greater than the fuel used to import all UK food and drink. Soil carbon loss is a major issue. When it comes to another potent greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, agriculture dominates the sources of emissions. They come from soil processes principally relating to the use of fertiliser. Methane is another powerful greenhouse gas, and in the UK, agriculture is the single biggest source. 70% of this is generated by cattle alone from their anaerobic digestion of food, call it enteric fermentation. Outside of farming, landfill emissions are the second dominant source of methane in the UK. This lies significantly within the food chain too, because much of the landfill methane comes from food waste. So in summary, for greenhouse gases, agriculture is the major source in the UK for both nitrous oxide and methane emissions. Expanding agricultural land overseas is usually at the expense of deforestation. This causes a hugely important source of emissions attributable to the global food system. The UK food system is part of the global food system, contributing to the underlying forces on land use change. A report by WWF estimated that food-driven global land use change emissions add a further 50% to our food chain carbon footprint. Other estimates of food chain greenhouse gas emissions often overlook this. So, how do agricultural greenhouse gas emissions compare with the rest of the food chain in the UK? Agriculture generates half of the whole food chain greenhouse gases, with the rest of the food industry comprising 40%. So improvements in food sustainability must address both agriculture and the downstream processes. The food chain as a whole generates a significant proportion of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions, and so improving food chain sustainability will play a big part in improving national sustainability performance. So as we draw to the end, let's take stock. We've seen that the issues that are important to sustainability in the food industry are complex, and you have to be careful in analysis. During the contact period, we will look at analytical tools more closely. And it's not just about science, but about far-reaching issues of social equity and ethics. The World Resource Institute summarizes this by saying, to sustainably close the food gap, the world must reduce growth in food consumption, increase food consumption on the same land area, and reduce agriculture's environmental impact. So, we've been looking at the key sustainability issues affecting the food chain. In week 4, you'll be looking at some company sustainability plans in detail to see how far real companies go to address these issues. But I'll leave you now with Coca-Cola's summary of their key sustainability themes.